Hello and welcome to Truth, Lies and Work, the award-winning psychology podcast brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. My name is Leanne. I'm a business psychologist.
My name is Al. I'm a business owner.
We are here to help you simplify the science of work.
Welcome to another Thursday edition. Thursdays, we have the interviews. Tuesdays, we have the world-famous weekly workplace surgery. We have the news roundup and the brand new book club. If you're not listening to Tuesdays, perhaps get a cup of tea and a biscuit, sit down, have a little listen to. Although biscuit means a different thing in the US, doesn't it?
A cookie.
A cookie. There you go. We have an amazing guest for you today. Dimple Dhabalia is the founder of Roots in the Clouds, a consulting firm that specializes in using storytelling to heal individual and organizational trauma. Don't worry, we will go into those terms in just a second. She's a writer, a podcaster, a coach, and a facilitator with over 20 years of public service experience. She's got a book and it's called Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self. Now, Leanne interviewed Dimple a few weeks ago after reading a book, and you got into some pretty deep topics, didn't you, Lee?
Yeah, we did. We talked about Dimple's time working for the Attorney General's office in Colorado, then to New Delhi, where she was a field office director of the Immigration Office. Her work is tough. Her work was really tough. She was exposed to a lot of traumatic and heartbreaking experiences. And at the time, Dimple looked like she was in control and handling it well. But there was one night in a hotel room just after working with refugees in Zambia where she broke down and realized things needed to change. In fact, her doctor told her if she didn't go home right away, she might never make it. Obviously, this episode comes with numerous trigger warnings. We touch on devastating humanitarian crises, child abuse, domestic violence, and horrific situations like the one in Africa with Idi Amin. Dimple was able to turn 20 years of experience of dealing with vicarious trauma into a phenomenal book that not only helps anyone working in tough environments or managing teams who work in environments like that, but also provide a framework to prioritize your own mental health.
So some of this might sound like it's going to be tough to listen to, and some of it might be tough to listen to, but it's Dimple's extraordinary self-awareness that we want you to hear about today. And you don't need to be working in war zones or refugee camps for this to be applicable. The lessons, as we said before, are just as important for anyone who leads teams where work can be highly stressful. So before we join the interviews, a couple of terms that Dimple uses I think we need to define. Firstly, Leah, what does organisational trauma and moral injury mean?
Well, organisational trauma, first of all, refers to a psychological phenomenon where an organisation experiences a significant disruption or a distressing event, and that deeply affects its functioning and its stability. So it's about the organisation. The trauma can stem from internal factors like major layoffs, leadership scandals, or significant restructuring, or from external factors such as economic downturns, natural disasters, or an attack on the workforce. COVID-19 was an organisational trauma. The impact of organisational trauma can manifest in various ways, including a decline in employee morale, increased turnover, a breakdown in communication and trust within the organisation, and a significant drop in overall performance. It may also lead to a lingering atmosphere, feelings of fear, uncertainty, stress among employees, infighting, and of course it will affect individual well-being and productivity as well. Moral injury. This is when people go through extremely stressful or traumatic situations. They might do something, fail to do something, or see something that clashes with their core moral beliefs. If someone acts in a way that contradicts their beliefs, it's called an act of commission. If they don't act according to their beliefs, it's called an act of omission. People can also feel betrayed by leaders or peers who behave in this way, a way that contradicts their beliefs. So moral injury refers to the emotional and psychological stress that happens after these events that go against our own moral code. For a moral injury to happen, the person must believe that a moral line has been crossed either by themselves or others. So common feelings associated with moral injury include guilt, shame, disgust, anger, and research suggests that moral injury is widespread, particularly amongst members in the military, and is linked very closely to anxiety, depression, PTSD, and of course, a risk of suicide. Health workers are also more vulnerable to moral injury. And if we think again back to the pandemic, many doctors and nurses had to make life or death decisions when they were pressed for time and resources. And these difficult conditions have led to many in the healthcare system feeling moral injury.
If you remember our episode back with the chief medical officer from the BBC, we talked a little bit about this as well. I think there's one other term, which is compassion fatigue. Can you just talk us quickly through that?
Yeah. So again, the pandemic provides a really good example of this. So do you remember the clap for carers?
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the UK, if you've not heard of it, every Thursday evening at 8:00, people would come to their doorsteps and clap for a minute or two and support the frontline workers that were sacrificing so much to keep us safe. Lockdown regulations, so a really nice initiative. But lockdown regulations lasted for 18 months in the UK. Clap for carers lasted for 2 months. And why? It's because we were all suffering from compassion fatigue. The frequency of this social movement in support of people who were suffering became too much, and we became indifferent, desensitized to it. So compassion fatigue is the cost of caring for others or their emotional pain. Over time, we just get used to it and we become fatigued.
Yeah, all makes sense. You're going to hear Dimple use the term vicarious trauma. Don't worry, we do ask her to, or Leanne asks her to explain that in a second. Okay, so we're going to join the interview, and then every so often we'll come back and we'll explain something that might need a bit of context, and also perhaps ask Leanne some questions about it too. But for now, let's go back to the interview where Dimple introduced herself and Leanne finds out why she wrote the book.
So my name is Dimple Dhabalia. I am the founder of Roots in the Clouds, a boutique consulting firm that focuses on using the power of story to heal organizational trauma and moral injury in the workplace. I spent 20 years in the U.S. government working on asylum and refugee operations. Yeah, as a result of that work, I had some experiences with things like vicarious trauma, moral injury, compassion fatigue, and ultimately some burnout. And realized that I was working in a space that wasn't really resourced to support me. So I left my job to start an organization to try to help people kind of navigate through those things themselves. And most recently, I just published a book called Tell Me My Story, Challenging the Narrative of Service Before Self, which goes into a lot of this.
It was really your seeing your book that made me think we need to get you on the show, because it was so beautifully written and so engaging and so important in the information and message that it's sharing. So I'd love to dive more into the themes of the book today. I mean, in terms of before we do, what inspired you to write the book?
We, I think, exist in a culture kind of globally that kind of puts forward this idea that when we work in service of others, that we are somehow agreeing to sacrifice pieces of ourselves and pieces of our lives in order to do this work. And so we're kind of conditioned to believe that. And it's really damaging. I was about 6 years into my work with asylum seekers and refugees, and I was actually posted in Zambia on assignment. And as it was the first time in my career that I was struggling with actually regulating my emotions in real time. And so up until then, I'd always created what I called a wall of professionalism. And I think a lot of people in these lines of work are familiar with that and we do that as a protection mechanism so we can keep showing up to do the work. But it was the first time that for me, that wall started to come down, and I would be sitting in interviews with people and crying as they're telling me their stories. I felt very uneasy when we'd leave work. I would head straight to the bar at the hotel. I really wasn't sleeping. And if I did sleep, I had really horrific nightmares where I was reliving some of the stories that I had heard either earlier in the day or earlier in the week. And so all of these things together, I realized, something is just not right. And I was fortunate because when I started my career out, right out of law school, I was at the Attorney General's office in Colorado. And in that job, I was one of several attorneys who worked on child abuse and neglect issues. And we were fortunate because we had a boss who recognized that this kind of work takes a toll on people, especially when you're doing it over a long period of time. And so he used to make us go through an annual vicarious trauma training. And I remember as a new attorney not understanding why we needed this and thinking, I don't need this, I'm fine. But it planted a seed. And it was almost a full decade later when I was actually in Zambia after that job that kind of came to fruition. And so I realized, hey, you know what? There's definitely an issue here. And I started thinking about and wondering, maybe that what I'm experiencing is vicarious trauma. And so I started researching it and looking it up and realized that, yeah, in fact, that's what it is. But there was so much shame around what I was experiencing because when I looked around, it looked like everyone around me was doing fine and that I was the only one dealing with this.
If anyone is listening that perhaps working in a professional realm and they're hearing that term for the first time, but something's resonating with them, do you mind just telling us a bit about the definition of vicarious trauma, how you experienced it, and your first steps that you took to manage that?
Yeah. So vicarious trauma is basically where you experience trauma symptoms, even though you yourself didn't experience the trauma. So you're exposed to other people's trauma or stories of traumatic events, and you start to experience the trauma as though you had lived through that experience. It's interesting because not everyone experiences vicarious trauma, right? And so I think a lot of this has to do with, again, what we were exposed to in our childhood. I think that if we experience some kind of major trauma as children, then we are more susceptible to experiencing things like vicarious trauma or secondary traumatic stress or post-traumatic stress as we get older.
We are going to go back to this idea of how childhood can influence your work choices in just a second. But as we mentioned in the beginning, there was a specific moment where Dimple knew she needed to make a change. Let's go back to the interview where Leanne gets Dimple to open up about that night in the hotel room.
The story that you shared there and the way you share it in your book of your hotel room in Zambia is really powerful. I could feel my heart racing as I was reading it. And I'm wondering, and you described then that you felt something was different, something was wrong. When did you first realize that you might be experiencing burnout, and what steps did you take, especially when you were in the field, to manage that?
Yeah, so I'm really a stickler about terms, right? So in Zambia, I was not experiencing burnout. I was experiencing vicarious trauma. So at the time, my actual home base was in Greece. That's where I was working. I was at the embassy in Athens, Greece. So when I got back to Greece, I started to do some research and compare my symptoms to what vicarious trauma looks like. And the reason for that was because I had learned about this a decade earlier. So I had a little bit of an inkling. So all this happened. I recognized the signs and symptoms of the vicarious trauma. I started talking about it. I started advocating for it. We started offering trainings in our organization around it. But I was not taking my own advice. So then, it was a few years later that I then got selected to move to New Delhi to be the field office director of our immigration office out there. And it was the height of the refugee crisis. There was so much work to do. I was running the largest overseas office that we have, but I was expected to travel 2 to 3 weeks out of the month, which meant that when I came back, I had a pile of things on my desk that I had to deal with. And I was working all the time, and I wasn't exercising. I wasn't eating well. I wasn't, I didn't have any social connection because nobody really knew who I was, because the moment that I arrived there, I was traveling. And so all of these things together really impacted me. And I started, I got really sick while I was there within months of getting there. And I kept going to the med unit in between trips, and they'd be like, well, maybe it's this or maybe it's this, and nothing was working. And about 10, 11 months in, I came home for the holidays and have a really amazing doctor out here, functional medicine doctor. And I went to see him. He took one look at me and realized, hey, you know what? This is stress. Like, this is your body shutting down and attacking itself to try to protect you because of stress. And he was very, he said, you need to come home. And, again, because of the kind of cultures that we are conditioned to be in, I really struggled with that. I just moved out there. I hadn't even been there a full year. And there was this sense of like, I can't let people down. That was really eye-opening, because then he basically looked at me and said, okay, well, you can either come home now or maybe you don't come home at all. And so it should have been a no-brainer. But it took me about 4 days to finally talk to my leadership about it. And they were very supportive. And I did end up coming home. But again, it created so much shame for me.
And I'm just curious, as you've been talking, there's an emotion that you've used a couple of times, which is shame, which is a very powerful emotion. I just wonder why that was the overwhelming feeling you were experiencing, whilst you were also experiencing this perhaps realization of putting service before self.
Well, again, I think these cultures these are cultures we've inherited for generations, right? And the shame comes because we don't talk about any of this in the workplace, right? We don't, especially with mental health, we don't talk about it. And when it comes to like our own health and well-being, there's just this, like, there's often been this belief that doesn't belong in the workplace. That's your thing on your time. You're here to work. But again, as whole human beings, all of that goes together. And so when we expect people to just keep showing up and doing this work without acknowledging all these other things, we're creating cultures of shame, because what ends up happening is people, most people want to do their best. So they're going to come in, they're going to show up, they're going to do the best that they can every day. And as a result, as they look around, they see other people doing that too. So now it looks like, oh, everybody's fine. And internally, I'm struggling. I'm like, yeah, I don't feel so good about all this. I'm having, trouble managing my stress, or I'm exhausted, or, I'm just not focusing. But look, everybody around me is doing so good. So there's something wrong with me. And because nobody has talked about this to say, hey, you know what, there's nothing wrong with you. This is just, it's part of being human. And I always say being human is messy and serving humanity is messier, because, it's hard. But nobody's talking about that. So now, we walk around thinking I'm the only one. There's something wrong with me. And it just creates this hole that we climb into, and it gets harder and harder to climb out of until we talk about it as collective to say, yeah, this is hard. And hey, are you struggling? Because I'm struggling. And as soon as we start talking about it and we give voice to it, it's like that starts to erase the shame. So like with me, we had mental health issues in my family. We had domestic violence issues in my family. All those kinds of traumas, I carried those within me. And they became the lens through which I then experienced the world around me, and how I showed up and why I thought I had to be a certain way. So in the book, I have that story about a bigoted neighbor in my neighborhood, and the impact that had on me in terms of being, a woman of color. I spent a good chunk of my life trying to get rid of this identity and take on an identity that was more white, because I thought that would help me fit in more. It would make me belong, right? And so that's like an added dimension that people that are bringing into the workplace that we don't often even recognize, that's kind of directly impacting our relationships with people at work, and how we interact with others, how we show up to do our work, all these kinds of things. And so there's so many of these kinds of dynamics at play that often aren't taken into consideration. And so this is where, the more that we start talking about these things, the more that we create space for people to acknowledge the realities of their lives and the work, the more that we can start to take that shame out of the workplace.
With that in mind then, Dimple, do you think that some people are somehow predisposed to want to go into humanitarian work or human service work, either because of their family history, their biology, or their lived experiences as they're growing up?
The generational piece of this, and it doesn't even have to be trauma necessarily, but I do think, in the book, I talk a lot about our shaping stories. So these are the stories that, again, are created through our experiences, through what we are told, and they become the lens through which we experience the world. And so, I think a lot of people that I have met over the course of my career that go into these kinds of professions of serving others have either had an experience where they were on the receiving end of being taken care of, or they witnessed other people doing this kind of work and it influenced their decision to to walk the same path. And so I think there is a tie-in there. And especially if you yourself have experienced something with my family, I didn't know for a long time. I knew that my mom's side of the family had left Uganda during the Idi Amin regime, and my family's Indian, and he had expelled all the Indians. And my mom and most of her siblings and my grandparents got out before that happened, but a couple of my uncles ended up leaving as refugees. And so for many years, we knew that they had left Uganda and all that but I didn't know the refugee piece until much later. But there was something within me that kept drawing me back to wanting to serve in this position or in this way, working with asylum seekers and refugees. And so I think, that there is something there that kind of shows up in ways that you may not, it's like more than meets the eye, kind of, that you don't necessarily realize why you're being drawn to read this particular thing or to, explore this particular job path, But yeah, I do think that they're related.
This idea of shame is such a huge motivator. Leah, I always felt it was something more that men experience, but I feel like I might actually be being a little bit sexist here.
No, I don't think you're being sexist. I mean, there are a lot of things we still don't really know about emotions, including how different genders experience them. There was actually a recent meta-analysis on this. Meta-analysis, you remember this from last Tuesday, right? What's a meta-analysis, Al?
It is the analysis of multiple reports brought up into one big mega report. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. It's a super analysis. But yes, it's a study that analyzes lots of data from lots of different studies. In this case, over 236,000 individual ratings of what are called self-conscious emotions, which include shame. The findings actually showed that women report slightly more shame than men, but the differences are very, very small. And interestingly, the only area where men showed slightly more of an emotion was in hubristic pride, which involves arrogance or an exaggerated sense of self-importance. Where the differences did come in was in how men and women experience these emotions, and this difference is rooted in societal norms. There's a research professor at the University of Houston called Brené Brown. She's studied shame for years and have found that typically women feel shame when they fail to live up to societal expectations, so things around appearance, femininity, and motherhood. I'm sure that sounds familiar to a lot of women listening. In contrast, shame for men equates to failure, a feeling of not being good enough. And this extends to home, work, and general life. And as a result, men avoid intimate relationships. They avoid being known because, well, if you really know me, you'll know I'm not good enough, smart enough, lovable enough. It's this isolation that impacts mental health, which, alongside feeling inadequate and not meeting society's expectations of what it means to be a man, very much in the bunny ears, it can lead to very visceral reactions to shame for men, powerful physical responses that can happen automatically and without conscious control, including, sadly, suicide attempts. Emotions are a universal human experience. We all experience emotions, but how we react can differ. And that is often based on our environment and the society we live in. And that is why many experts, psychologists, activists are against this hyper masculinity bullshit that Andrew Tate and at times Jordan Peterson can throw around, because it reinforces an unreasonable societal norm that men may feel pressured to live by. And the outcome, well, at best, burnout as a badge of honor. And at worst, well, we see that in the disproportionate number of men that die by suicide each year.
Yeah, this badge of honor. Well, Dimple talks quite openly about this, and she calls it the martyr culture that can be present in some humanitarian organizations. However, it's not just organizations at the coalface where this can come up. Let's rejoin the interview where Leanne's going to ask her to explain more about hero and martyr cultures and what impact it can have on workplace culture.
Before we move on to those changes that you made, I want to ask you about the culture in humanitarian organizations. I think many people be familiar with hustle culture and burnout being, a badge of honor in that business world, that very corporate world. Some people listening might be surprised to hear that this also applies to humanitarian organizations. I think you used the term hero culture. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Part of the problem with the Industrial Revolution is that it made us lose our humanity in the workforce, right? Because all of a sudden we're looking at the people, like they've taken this model that's meant to be applied to kind of factory settings and applied it across the board and like across industries. And this model does not work when you're in an industry where you are expected to work with other human beings. So in these cultures then, where we don't have that sense of humanity, but we're supposed to show up and be human with other people, there's this added degree of responsibility sometimes that, you feel like, oh, if I don't finish this case, then that's impacting someone's life. Or if I don't, get this one, piece of paperwork done, then that means that this person's going to have to wait longer for whatever. In the medical profession, you think about like it's very high stakes, right? We never forget or are allowed to forget that we are working in service of other humans that are, vulnerable. They're vulnerable populations. They're people who need help. And so these things always end up going together where you just feel like, oh my gosh, if I don't do my part, then I'm impacting somebody else in a way that I don't want to do. And so that's what I think ends up creating like these like feelings of martyrdom in many of us as we're walking around doing the work. But like, it's not that I would recognize that I'm, I probably would never have said, yeah, I'm a martyr, I'm doing this thing. But that's kind of what seeps into the culture. And so we end up creating this culture of a lot of people walking around like, oh, we'll just do this one extra thing. We'll just do this one extra thing. And then as it moves up the organization, that just becomes the norm and the expectation. So that when you have people who are doing just what their job requires, now we start looking at that like, oh, that's not enough. And then we hear terms like, oh, that's quiet quitting, which is a terrible term because people aren't quitting. They're just doing their actual job and not doing so much extra work. And so so with martyrdom culture, it's just this feeling of, we'll just keep going because we have to, other people's lives are so much worse. And so let me just take care of doing this thing so that I'm helping in some way to make it better, Through that process, I created a leadership program. It was one of the first leadership programs based in mindfulness and positive psychology within the U.S. government. And we had incredible data coming out of that initial pilot program. And what we found was that at the end of a year, because we were doing these 360 reviews along the way, and what we found was that the people on the teams that were led by leaders who went through our program, the way that they came out of that first year of COVID as a tight unit was very different from the experiences of other people in the organization. But what happened was that when we actually presented these findings, we were met with comments like, I can't believe we're still allocating resources towards programs that don't contribute to meeting the mission. And so that was kind of the tipping point for me, where I felt like if you can't understand how having a healthy, mentally healthy and physically healthy workforce contributes to meeting the mission, then I can't really help you at this point. And so that was kind of the tipping point for me to actually leave and start my own company to be able to do this kind of work. And it was really that what led me to actually write the book, because I realized that so many organizations out there have these incredible missions and these ethos of care for the people that they're serving. And yet that is not what the people within the organizations are often experiencing. And so I really wanted to highlight that, number one, this is what happens in this kind of work. And what do leaders and organizations need to do to really support their people so that they can keep doing this work?
Just want to quickly interrupt. This is a great point to emphasize Dimple's question, but we'll come back to that in just a second after the break. Just a second ago, Dimple asked the great question. She said, what do leaders need to do to support their people? It turns out there are some simple steps that Dimple's research uncovered. And if you still feel that self-care and mindfulness is a bit fluffy, then firstly, Leanne will hunt you down and kick your ass. But secondly, Dimple points out that if you can work for someone who hears horrific stories every day at work, then it's 100% going to work for you and your team. Here's Dimple outlining what she discovered.
A lot of the kind of resources out there were all based in mindfulness, mindful awareness. So I will say this. Number one, if you think that you're experiencing something like this, it's always good to talk with a professional. So I also definitely did talk to a therapist. I think therapy is incredibly important. But it's not the only thing. And so the thing I love about mindful awareness is the more that we start to cultivate awareness of our thoughts, our emotions, the corresponding body sensations, because our body sends us messages all day long, even before the brain has a chance to realize and form a thought around it. So the more that we can start to notice these things, the more that we can actually address root issues that we're experiencing. And the other piece of that is, with mindful awareness, it's really important to practice self-compassion. And I say this because once we start creating awareness of what's happening, we start noticing everything. And so there's a desire to just want to change what's happening. But because these are conditioned reactions, these are things that we've experienced for many, many years, we have very, very deeply etched neural pathways already in place. And this is why we often default to certain reactions and ways of dealing with situations. And so to create new neural pathways, we actually have to start making new choices. And we have to do that over and over and over again for a while before we start creating new ways of doing things. And so these new neural pathways, even though they're starting to be formed, it's very easy to backslide or, go back to an old way of doing something. And when that happens, we often, the kind of inner critic in our head, we will really berate ourselves and get down on ourselves. And so when I talk about self-care, in the book, I talk about redefining self-care, because historically, self-care has been marketed as an indulgence, right? So we think about, when we hear self-care, we think about things like bubble baths, and we think about, sitting on the sofa with a magazine, a cup of tea, and these are all valid forms of self-care. But when I think about self-care, I'm thinking about how do we reset our nervous system in real time? Because when we go into experiencing stress, or we experience some kind of trauma, we're activating our sympathetic nervous system. And that sympathetic nervous system is that kind of what we hear about, the fight or flight response, right? There's actually, in the book, I talk about 5 responses. So there's fight, flight, freeze, fix, and fake. And so all of these responses are important, like when we're genuinely in harm's way, or, where we could be in danger. The problem is that our brain cannot tell the difference between actual harm or perceived harm. And it can't tell the difference between harm to our bodies versus harm to like our ego or identity. It looks at all of that the same. It's all the same threat level. So we have to start to recognize when, oh, you know what, this is just, I'm scared, or I'm nervous, or, because my boss sent me an email that's kind of vague. So this is like, I'm nervous in this moment, but I'm not in any danger per se. And this is important because when our sympathetic nervous system is activated, there's all kinds of stress hormones moving through the body. And because this system was only designed to be on for short periods of time, and so using that self-awareness, using that self-compassion, we can start to notice what area is actually feeling depleted. And so in the book, I talk about kind of 6 areas, and all of these areas correspond to human flourishing. And so the idea is that when these 6 areas of our life are activated, as humans, we are in a space of flourishing. And so if we can start to notice what, so if it's our mental bucket, if it's our emotional bucket, if it's our physical bucket, our relational bucket, I have one there for practical. And so practical is stuff like, I am really stressing about money. So in that moment, an act of self-care might be sitting down to create a budget for myself. So the more that we can start to notice where our stress is coming from, and what specific kind of bucket is feeling depleted or in need of care, then we can start using targeted acts of self-care to address that. And that's really, to me, like what can kind of help us move through some of these, and not necessarily even move through, but at least it helps us create a wider window of stress tolerance on the front end. So this is what helps us stay like more resilient, is the word that a lot of people use, right? So the more that we can start to practice these things on the front end before we get to the point of trauma or burnout or post-traumatic stress or any of that things, the more that we do this on the front end, the less likely it becomes that we'll actually get all the way to the other end of that.
I love that advice, and I love that approach so much. I think it sounds almost like a person can individualize their self-care based on their views and perceptions of the world. I know there's some people out there that find this all, as you say, a bit indulgent, a bit fluffy, a bit, I shouldn't have the time for that. So I think that those practical steps that you mentioned could be a really good entry point for people who might be more reluctant to engage in self-care. I mean, you also use mindfulness and positive psychology at an organisational level when you mentioned the management training that you developed. What were the main pillars of that, and what skills within leaders were you targeting to level up?
Yeah, so it's still, it's similar to what I was just talking about. So what was interesting about that particular training was that it was very self-focused. And so, there's a lot of misconceptions around the term self, right? We always associate it with being selfish. And selfish has a very negative connotation. But the reality is that you can't lead others effectively if you can't lead yourself. And if you don't understand your own, why you're reacting a certain way or how you show up, it's really tough to then be able to do that for other people. So we focused a lot, again, on these 3 kind of principles of self-awareness, self-compassion, self-regulation. And so the training itself really had leaders spending time learning about themselves. So a lot of practices around how do we cultivate greater self-awareness? Why is this important? And then, how do we cultivate the self-compassion? What does that actually mean? Because I think for a lot of leaders and high achievers, self-compassion feels like, oh, it's very soft. It's, it's not going to motivate me. But the reality is self-compassion. So there's a ton of research out there about self-compassion, and self-compassion has been shown to be far more effective at getting us to do the things that we need to do than the self-criticism and the being really harsh with ourselves. But in terms of, in the book, when I talk about things that leaders and organizations can do, I'm really talking about creating a holistic, human-centered duty of care for staff. And part of this is that, most organizations, when you talk about duty of care, they're talking about like your safety in the workplace. That's what they consider their duty of care. But I think that, again, because we're whole human beings, we have to look at the needs of the whole human beings that are serving in our organizations. And so that has four distinct pillars. And so the pillars that I talk about that I believe can help us create more of that in the workplace are, first of all, normalizing and addressing occupational mental health challenges and trauma. Number two is evolving from metrics-driven cultures into human-centered ones. Number three is supporting rest and recovery. And number four is fostering shared purpose and commitment. And so the idea is that all four of these, like, this is what organizations owe to their staff. And here's why it's important. And I talk about this a lot, but especially around the metrics issue, right? Metrics are important in workplaces. They are what help us understand if we're on target, if we're meeting, the goals that we're setting. And we go to work, right? So that's understandable. But the problem is that in most organizations, metrics are the sole driving force behind policies, and the sole consideration for policies within the workplace. And that's where the problem is. And so we want to bring in these aspects of workforce well-being and incorporate them into how we're creating metrics in our organization. But all of this stuff, the more that we invest in our people in this way, it makes a difference, because when you think about how much organizations pay to train staff, especially new staff, and if you aren't retaining staff for several years, you're not getting a return on investment. And I hate talking in those terms because these are people. But this is often what organizations need to hear, right? And the other piece of that is when it's not just that, people are walking out, and there's a real shift as we see more millennials and Gen Z, members of Gen Z coming into the workforce, because they don't work the way that Gen X and, baby boomers worked. It's a different mindset, and they're really looking for, again, like a whole life experience, which includes their own health and well-being, as it should. And so there used to be this thing, this thinking that, oh, well, if you don't want this job, it's fine, because especially in mission-driven spaces, where they have an incredible mission, there was always this idea like, oh, well, if you don't want it, it's okay. There's, 10 people in line behind you who would take your job in a minute. But that bench is not deep anymore. And it is not that easy to, and especially post-COVID, people really started to reevaluate what was important. And so it's not that easy anymore. And the other thing that you end up losing as an organization is, so if you, obviously if you're losing people, you're, spending a lot of money to train people and then not getting that return on the investment. But the institutional knowledge, and that one is you can't really put a price on it per se, but if you think about it, in a lot of these types of work, there's a level of confidence that needs to be there for people to make these kinds of decisions or interact in the way that we need them to act. And when you're first in the job, you don't have it, and it takes time to build that up. But if you don't have people staying long enough to build that up, you're not creating any institutional knowledge. And so now, tasks that should take a certain amount of time are going to take longer, or maybe decisions aren't getting made because people don't feel comfortable making decisions. And so all these things then have an add-on effect, which ultimately does impact the bottom line of an organization. So this is why I say that I think that all of these things together actually in the long run, really benefit the organization as much as it benefits the people.
If there is one book you need to read this summer, it should be Tell Me My Story.
It really is such a good book. I mean, it might not sound like the book you'd take on holiday, but it is an incredibly engaging read that is half memoir, half manifesto, and it does offer some really practical strategies and calls to action. If you are a leader and you care about your people, then this is an absolute must read. That said, there are some themes that may be challenging depending on your own mental health right now and your own window of tolerance. You're the best judge of that. And when you are ready, this book will be waiting for you. Of course, we will leave a link in the show notes.
Next week is a psychology special edition on Thursday. We've got a panel of amazing people who Leanne's put together. Leanne, do you remember what we're going to be talking about?
Yes, in a nutshell, we're going to talk about how to pick an expert. We talk a lot about getting support from experts, but are they psychologists? Are they management consultants? Are they something else? What's the difference? Why does it matter? And how can you tell which one you need? Well, we will answer all of that for you. A very practical episode next week. We'll be joined by some incredible psychologists to give you all of the information on that. And if you do follow the British Psychological Society and their recent, shall we say, questionable action around some of the qualifications, including occupational psychology, educational psychology, and counselling psychology, then we do have some reactions to that too. It's not a scandal. It's not a sensational like, oh, shock, but it is some pretty honest and brutal reactions to recent BPS behaviour. So tune in for that. Before we go, here is where to find out more about Dimple and also a little bit more about her podcast.
You can head to my website, which is rootsintheclouds.com. That's all plural. You can also find me at DimpStory, DIMP Story, across all social media platforms. And I also have something called Dear Humanitarian on Substack. And I have a couple of podcasts, which might be fun for people. Well, one is fun. It's called What Would Ted Lasso Do? And that one does explore lessons in leadership and or explores each episode through the lens of leadership and positive psychology. And then I have another one called Service Without Sacrifice, Conversations on Hope and Healing. And so that one is more along with the book. So yeah, please check all of that out and definitely reach out.
I hope today's episode has made you think a little bit. If you've got any questions, any thoughts, anything you want to ask, go on LinkedIn. If you want to ask Leanne something privately, then by all means, look in the show notes. You can email her. She looks at and answers every single email that listeners send. So if there's something that's happened or there's an issue that's been brought up by today's episode, then feel free to email Leanne.
Yes, we do also leave a few resources in the show notes as well. The Mind website has lots of great resources and signposting points. And of course, there is the numbered email address for the Samaritans. If any of the themes in today's episode have been challenging for you, do please consider using those resources.
So we'll see you on Tuesday for our world famous weekly workplace surgery episode. And then next Thursday, where we'll talk about experts and we'll teach you who you need to bring in. Anything else to add, my love?
I don't think so. I'm getting a bit warm now.
We'll see you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Is what can lead to very
Then we think humanitarian. Nearly had that.
Oh, sorry. I need to do the bit, don't I?
No.
Get rid of a sneeze.
If your biggest challenge is missing a deadline, then you put the wrong emphasis on the word.
We should send our outtakes to the. Did you see that with the
With a guy
I want to go in finance.